Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Niall Edworthy and Major Tim Brown. Niall, you're the author of Main Battle Tank, a book that's out in paperback today. First of all, when you started writing the book, were you surprised at some of the stories you uncovered?
I was. I mean, my original brief was to cover one particular operation in the 3 weeks of the fighting phase of the invasion. But as soon as I started researching and interviewing and investigating, I went out to Fallingbostel and met the regiment. I discovered there was an enormous amount of what went on out there. A lot of fighting. All 3 squadrons out there, A, B, and C, were involved in a lot of operations, very challenging operations. Lots of very daring raids, and yeah, I was amazed by how much they were involved in.
Well, before we chat more, let's just hear a little excerpt from the book now. Okay. This is a section where, Tim, I think you were about to lead your squadron on an early morning raid in Iraq, and you came under attack as you were preparing to lead your men out. Let's just have a listen to this excerpt here.
The first 2 rounds were followed in quick succession by half a dozen further explosions that erupted in giant balls of bright light across the camp. Deep in sleep just seconds earlier, some of the men rolled off the back decks, bounced off the sides of their tanks and crashed onto the concrete concourse. Leaving their boots, trousers and sleeping bags on the decks, the rest scrambled for cover. Some dived into the hatches of the tanks, but most, including Major Brown, leapt under their vehicles.
Well, Tim, that's you that we're referring to, obviously. Major Brown, you leapt under your vehicle. It must have been an incredibly frightening situation to be involved in.
Yes, it was. I don't think anything in training can really prepare you for the experience of coming under artillery fire. Training tries to prepare you for most things, but that's something that it can't do. And that was the first time we had come under artillery fire, and it was an incredibly terrifying experience. Your body takes over, really, and you just leap for cover and sit it out. Fortunately, it was relatively short, and we were able to get up into the tanks fairly quickly afterwards. What
was interesting is that it goes on to say in the book how you then had to make the decision, should you continue with the raid that had been planned? Were your men in a mental state to do that? Well, fortunately, it was in the very early hours of the morning that the artillery came down. We had actually probably 2 or 3 hours after the raid finished to compose ourselves, to make sure that the wounded, those that had been injured by shrapnel and things, were dealt with and casevaced before preparing ourselves for the raid, which was to take place at dawn. So there was an element of doubt in my mind for a short period of time as we licked our wounds effectively. And I think once we got over that and focused on the mission that was coming up, we were all delighted and prepared mentally to go forward and carry out the raid. Neil, what also strikes you when you read the book is how young some of the crew members are involved in some of the dramatic incidents that take place.
Well, that's right. That was a surprise to me. Well, not a surprise, but you're right. Particularly, I think that the drivers and the gunners tended to be the youngest in the crew. And yes, it must have been an extraordinary and terrifying and nerve-wracking and exhilarating experience for them. But then you have the tank commanders like Major Brown, who served in the First Gulf War, and I think the more senior hands played a very big role in guiding the younger ones. But I think it must have been a very nerve-wracking experience.
The other point that you make in the book, which I think brings home, is the fact that these tanks were never designed to be used in the roles that they were used for in Iraq. They just weren't designed for those kind of conditions.
Well, I think that at the time, Major Tim can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I mean they were these guys train on on the plains of Germany, Canada, and Poland, in the mud and the forest there, and they also they're trained to work in wide open spaces and move fast. And in Iraq, they were obviously operating in a semi-desert environment, and also they were operating in towns where you generally don't want to take a tank into a main battle tank into a town with its tight streets, where it's more vulnerable to RPG attack and whatever. So for these guys had to sort of make it up as they went along, and it was all new for them. And this is what I think made their achievement so remarkable. They did not have any experience of urban fighting in heavy armour, and yet they pulled it off spectacularly. And they showed that the Challenger 2, which had never been used in anger before, and they used it to incredibly significant and successful effect.
Tim, after coming through those experiences, how much affinity do you have with that piece of equipment now?
It's a bond that you form with your vehicle rather surprisingly, and we talked about this in the book a bit. It's a massive, great chunk of iron, but it's your home for lengthy periods of time, and you do build up a relationship born out of the camaraderie you have with your crew and the other members of the squadron around you. So the relationship is not so much with the vehicle itself, although it becomes your home, your everything in effect during operations.
And in terms of throwing it forward then, what is the future for tanks and tank warfare within the British military, do you think?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, the tank is an expensive bit of kit, particularly to maintain and to keep modifying, to keep it at the very forefront of its ability. Certainly tanks would appear to have taken a bit of a back seat at the moment. We haven't seen them in action, obviously, since 2003 or so. And there are plenty of lighter, more mobile weapon systems and vehicles in Afghanistan and things. I think that the role of the tank will always be unique and arguably impossible to replace. It is a vehicle on the ground. The attack helicopter will never hold ground in the way that a tank can. Many people think perhaps the tank's had its day, but cavalry has continued to evolve through the centuries. And I suspect that it will have the last laugh and it will come back one day in some form or other.
And they said, didn't they, before the last Gulf War, that the tank had its day then, and then it turned up in Iraq and did a fantastic job, proving that it still had value then. And as Tim says, perhaps it'll prove once again that it's got value in different...
On that note, hopefully then, this isn't sort of the obituary of the tank, it's just a part of one of the chapters in its history, if you see what I mean. Brilliant, well thank you very much for coming in, guys. We've got to leave it there, but just to say that this book is out in paperback today, is that right?
It's out today, exactly.
Out today,
yeah.
Brilliant. Well thank you very much for coming in.
Not at all.
Neil and Tim, thank you.
Thank you very much.